At 8 o'clock on the evening of 27 January 1944, 4 days after the last German shell fell on Leningrad, Vera Inber made it from a party meeting to the old Riverside Parade ground known as the Field of Mars, just in time for the official victory salute. Parks, bridges, and embankments were packed with people, mixed up with tanks and military motorbikes. From the dockyards in the west to the Smolny Institute in the east, 324 guns fired 24 salvos, flames shooting from their muzzles like hellfire in old pictures. Flares arched above the Neva, their crimson, green, blue, and white reflected on the ice and on a sea of upturned faces. A searchlight picked out the gilded angel on top of the Peter and Paul spire, the beam so sharp that it seemed solid, a bridge up which one could walk to heaven. Quote, "The greatest event in the life of Leningrad," end quote, Inber wrote in her diary later that night. "Complete liberation from the blockade. And here, though I'm a professional writer, words fail me. I simply state that Leningrad is free." Welcome to the first narrative episode of 2025 for Beyond Barbarossa, still the only English-language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Red Beard Studio on traditional Anishinaabe Algonquin land, also called Ottawa, Canada. And I'm joined today by my assistant, Ragnar the Magnificent. He's a ragdoll cat. Remember, you can get early, usually, and ad-free always access to episodes by sponsoring Beyond Barbarossa on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you're comfortable with. Supporters also get bonus episodes, such as the latest about the T-34 tank, the best tank of World War II. This is episode 66, where we discuss the first of Stalin's crushing blows against the invading Third Reich, the Zhitomyr-Berdichiv operation and the liberation of Leningrad. Before I go on, if you find this episode sounds a little different than previously, I'm going to blame the dogs. You see, last week I was at the dog park, letting dogs off leash, and when I wasn't looking, some tumbled into me from behind. They hit the back of my knee. That knocks you down no matter what you do. And as I fell, the quadriceps tendon tore from my kneecap. Now, I've had the surgery already to repair the damage. Shout out to the surgical and recovery teams at the Ottawa Civic Hospital. But I'm going to be on crutches for the next few weeks, which makes putting up my sound control system, such as it is, a little more challenging. In fact, I'm only going to do the very bare minimum. So if I do sound a little more echoey than before, that's why. Blame the dogs. Also, blame the dogs for the ad-free Patreon version not coming out all that early. Everything takes me longer right now. The other sound you might hear would be a rushing or a humming sound, and that's because the furnace is going. It's January in Ottawa, and right now I just don't have the energy to go over and turn off the thermostat. I've lost a quarter of my strength, so bear with me, please. I mentioned at the beginning this is the first narrative episode. By that I mean episodes where I describe the progress of the war on the Eastern Front chronologically. And the last time I did that was episode 63 last December. So it's been over a month since we were discussing the progress of the war, so I hope you haven't lost track too much. I do want to take one more moment to once again thank Claire Mully, author of Agent Zoe, as well as several other books, and Roger Moorhouse, author of, among others, The Devil's Alliance, for taking the time to discuss their books on this podcast. And if you haven't heard those, go back and listen to them. They are wonderful interviews, some of the best episodes I think that I've managed to do. But go back after you get to the end of this episode. Don't touch that dial. Now, let's get back to the chronological description of the Second World War. Our 81-year delay brings us to January 1944, and we have a lot to catch up on since December 1943. On 7 November 1944, Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin gave a speech on the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which brought the communists to power in Russia. In that speech, he cited 10 crushing blows delivered against the invading Third Reich. The first he mentioned was the liberation of Leningrad after its 900-day siege. But that was actually the second crushing blow in chronological terms. The first started on 24 December 1943 and continued until April 1944, what the Soviets called the liberation of Right Bank Ukraine, or the Dnieper-Carpathian Campaign. It began with the Zhitomyr-Berdichiv Offensive from 24 December 1943 to 31st January 1944. We covered that in episode 63, and I'll recap it in a minute. The second crushing blow is one of the most iconic moments of the war, the liberation of Leningrad. I know I've said before that I hesitate to call anything the Red Army did a liberation, but I think it fits in this case, as do a few others, such as the liberation of concentration camps that the Red Army discovered as they moved westward. But let's not get ahead of the story. Now, the last narrative episode on the Red Army's reconquest of Ukraine described how the Red Army's first Ukrainian front, under Nikolai Vatutin, recaptured Kiev on 6 November 1943. Then that same First Ukrainian Front pushed Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army 145 kilometers or 90 miles west to Zhitomyr. After being pushed back east again, halfway to Kiev, they regrouped and struck southward. So, starting on 24 December, the 38th Army of that First Ukrainian Front began a heavy bombardment southward toward Berdichiv. The SS Panzer divisions opposing them were quickly reduced to double-digit numbers of tanks and assault guns and 100 men per battalion. They were also almost completely encircled. The Germans had to abandon the city of Zhitomyr for the last time on 31st December 1943. Army Group South also abandoned its headquarters in Vinnytsia. The Red Army's advances created a deep pocket of the Germans west of the city of Cherkassy, about 100 kilometers downstream from Kiev. In this pocket were the remnants of the German 3rd Panzer Corps and the 48th Panzer Corps. In total, 60,000 men with 59 tanks and 242 artillery pieces. We'll get to what happened to them. But first, let's see what else is happening in the war in January 1944. 9th January. British forces take the port of Mawdsley on the Bay of Bengal in Burma. 17 January. The First Battle of Monte Cassino south of Rome begins. On the 20th, the 36th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army suffers heavy losses as they attempt to cross the Gari River south of Cassino. 20th January. The RAF drops 2,300 tons of bombs on Berlin. 22nd January. American forces begin the attack on Anzio on the Adriatic coast of Italy in Operation Shingle. It does not go well for the Allies. 31st January. In the Pacific, American forces begin their attack on the Japanese-occupied Marshall Islands, halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines. Now that we've recapped the Zhitomyr-Berdichiv operation, leaving that great big pocket around Cherkassy, it's time to shift our focus north to Leningrad. It's a place we haven't been to very much over the past several episodes, almost the whole year, because in that time, there hasn't been a lot of movement or change in the situation around the USSR's second city. So before we go on, let's back up for context. The city of Leningrad lay at the eastern end of the Gulf of Finland, near the Finnish border. It was founded as St. Petersburg in 1703 by Russian Tsar Peter I. Taking a cue from my fellow podcaster Antony of Ukraine Without Hype, I refrain from referring to any czars as great. St. Petersburg became the new capital of the Russian Empire, with many grand buildings and palaces. You've probably seen movie versions of Anna Karenina, and that would give you a good idea of what the city was like. By the late 19th century, St. Petersburg was also the hotbed of revolutionary thought and activity. It was the setting for the October Revolution of November 1917, when Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. And that's largely the reason Hitler hated it so much he ordered the Wehrmacht to erase the city from the earth. By 29 August 1941, so 2 months and a week after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht was in the outskirts of Leningrad. To the east of the city, they soon reached the southern shore of Lake Ladoga at Schlisselburg by 8th September. To the west, the Germans reached the Gulf of Finland. With the Finnish army advancing down the Karelian Isthmus northwest of Leningrad, the city was effectively cut off. One Soviet group, the 8th Army, was cut off even more in a pocket around Oranienbaum on the Gulf of Finland west of Leningrad, reachable only by sea, a sea controlled by the Axis and its allies. Then Hitler ordered that rather than taken or conquered, Leningrad be besieged, starved. The Soviets evacuated or tried to evacuate about 500,000 citizens, mostly children and the elderly. The rest, about 3 million, were put to work building trenches, tank traps, blocks, bunkers, and other defenses. By this point, by the fall and the winter of 1941, the only way to bring in any supplies, ammunition, and food was over Lake Ladoga. Now, the Soviets managed to bring in about 450 tons of food a day to Leningrad. However, the 3 million inhabitants needed over 1,000 tons per day. And the Germans continued to bomb not only the city every single day, but also any transports carrying supplies. Eventually, when Lake Ladoga froze, the Soviets were able to switch from using barges over the lake to sledges and trucks. The city authorities had no choice but to ration food pretty severely, actually very severely, down to 600 calories per person per day to start in September. Then they had to cut that to 500 grams per day. And then, even further, they got down to as little as 125 grams per person per day, about a slice of bread. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the coldest in decades in Russia. And while it was also hard on the German invaders as well as the people of the USSR, in Leningrad it meant mass starvation. 100,000 people in Leningrad starved to death in 1942, and another 100,000 in February. You've probably heard that the siege of Leningrad lasted 900 days. That's what people say. It actually lasted 872 days, but people like round numbers, so it's usually referred to as the 900-day siege. In that time, so nearly 3 years, over 1 million people in Leningrad starved to death. Total deaths in the city, including those from bombing and combat, probably reached 1.5 million, although it's impossible to make a really firm determination. Beyond Barbarossa covers the siege from beginning to end in episode 12. So let's take a short break here. When we come back, we'll look at how the Red Army ended the siege of Leningrad. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. Beyond Barbarossa is still, as far as I can tell, the only English-language podcast in the world that focuses on the Eastern Front of World War II. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Welcome to part 2 of the Broken Knee episode. I mean, the first crushing blows against the Third Reich. We're looking at the siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 1944. After the Germans surrounded Leningrad, the Red Army made continuing efforts to lift the siege, and the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, authorized 2 major operations to break the siege. On 12 January 1943, a year and a half into the siege, the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts are groups of armies, began Operation Iskra, or Spark. The Leningrad front was stationed in, you guessed it, Leningrad itself. By the beginning of 1943, it included 18 separate armies. There's a map on the webpage for this episode to help clarify this. beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com, then click on the title for this episode, not the picture. The Volkhov front, it was the second front involved in this Operation Iskra, comprised 4 armies, and they were holding ground southeast of the city, around the Volkhov River. Also involved in this operation was the Baltic Fleet, stationed in the Gulf of Finland and stationed at Kronstadt Island, but pretty much hemmed in by the German Navy and the Finns. The Red Air Force began by bombing German headquarters, artillery positions, communication centers, and airfields on the night of 11th January 1943. At 9:30 a.m. on the 12th, the 2 army fronts began 2.5 hours of artillery bombardment. Then they began advancing east and west. Going was slow, often stopped with the Germans, but on 18 January, the first units of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts made contact. By noon, German Group Hohner was cut off between the corridor the Red Army had made and Lake Ladoga. They had to abandon their artillery and heavy equipment to break out southward, suffering heavy losses in the process. New lines stabilized by 21st January. The Soviets now held a strip along the south shore of Lake Ladoga, including Schlisselburg. They built a rail line to link Leningrad to the rest of the country to the east and began bringing in new supplies by 6th February. This relieved the siege, but did not end it. The rail link, after all, was still in the range of German artillery. So Marshal Zhukov, Stalin's military right hand, planned another operation, Polyarnaya Zvezda, or Polar Star. This involved 3 fronts, the Leningrad and Volkhov, plus the Northwestern Front, which was stationed south of the Volkhov Front around the Demyansk Pocket. The Demyansk Pocket was a deep salient, or a long very long, very thin bulge eastward in the front lines, just around the city of Demyansk. So the Soviets' goal was to create two separate encirclements of German units, one around the town of Maga, which is south of Schlüsselburg, and another to cut off the Demyansk salient, trapping the German forces there. The operation started on 10th February 1943, so less than 2 weeks after the end of Operation Iskra. And it was a failure for the Soviets. While they did manage to end the Demyansk pocket, that was mostly because the Germans had withdrawn from it before the Soviets struck. They knew it was a dangerous position, and pulling out shortened their lines and strengthened their defenses. Meanwhile, the encirclement at Maga just didn't work. The Soviets gained almost no ground. The Leningrad and Volkhov fronts were exhausted after Operation Iskra, and then the Rasputitsa or Berezhina, the season of no roads, where the mud is so deep it's impossible for vehicles to move, that season brought any movement to an end. So that's 1943. A year later, the German Army Group North still holds positions close to Leningrad, the Finns a position to the northwest. The Soviets have their narrow land link to Leningrad, and the Oranienbaum pocket is still isolated west of the city. After the Red Army's stunning advances in Ukraine and Belarus over the previous year, the Stavka now seemed to feel, in early 1944, that it was time to try Leningrad again. This time, the plan expanded to a three-pronged attack. The Leningrad front would attack southward, the Volkhov front would move west toward the ruined city of Novgorod, and meanwhile, Stavka moved another 52,000 troops secretly by sea into Oranienbaum. They would move eastward along the Gulf of Finland toward Leningrad. So, in essence, squeezing the Germans out, trapping as many as possible in the process. Altogether, the Soviet forces involved in this operation comprised 1,250,000 personnel, 1,580 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 1,390 aircraft, including long-range bombers from the Baltic Fleet. This was the first time the Red Air Force had assembled such a large number of aircraft. Over the past year, the German forces around Leningrad had been depleted, badly. Army Group North was now under the command of Field Marshal Kukler, and he had to release divisions to Army Groups Center and South, where the action had been over the previous spring, summer, and fall. Remember Kursk, Kharkiv, Kyiv, Smolensk, and Zhitomyr? So, in January 1944, Army Group North was down to 400,000 men, 16 tanks, 109 self-propelled guns, and 381 aircraft. And this is compared, as I just said, to over 1 million opponents. Kukler, recognizing his weakness, had wanted to withdraw to the so-called Panther defensive line running from Narva, the city on the Gulf of Finland, west of Lake Peipus to Pskov. But Hitler said no. He was determined to hold all the territory. So the stage is set. A weak German Army Group North stretched out along exposed positions, and a Soviet force 10 times its size ready to strike. And they did. On 14 January 1944, 104,000 shells fired in an hour and 5 minutes. I'll quote now from Evan Mawdsley's Thunder in the East, the Nazi-Soviet War 1941 to 1945. On 14 January 1944, the Soviet Second Shock Army, under General Fedyunsky, burst out of the Oranienbaum pocket. Some 44,000 Red Army troops had been secretly ferried there across the Gulf of Finland. A second attack was mounted from the southwestern part of Leningrad itself by the 42nd Army, and the two wings of the attack joined together on the evening of the 19th near the Leningrad suburban towns of Ropsha and Krasnoye Selo. The surviving German troops were able to pull out, but many of the heavy guns which had been bombarding Leningrad for 2 years were captured. End quote. This action, which brought the previously cut-off Oranienbaum pocket into contact with the main garrison at Leningrad, required the Germans pull out of Maga, which is 60 kilometers or 40 miles east of the town of Ropsha. As they retreated, the 67th Red Army, part of the Volkhov Front, chased them. Weather slowed the Red Army's advance for some days, but the 2nd Shock Army and the 42nd Army gained 3 kilometers or 2 miles, while the Volkhov Front itself made 5 kilometers or 3 miles. Then, warmer weather starting on 16 January allowed the 2nd Shock Army to move 23 kilometers, finally totally capture Ropsha and drive the Germans out of Krasnoye Selo. In 2 weeks, so now at the end of January, the Red Army had advanced 50 miles to the Luga River. And again, you can see that on the map that I put on the webpage. On 20th January, the 59th Army of the Volkhov Front reached ruined Novgorod. The Germans managed to break out and retreat, and the Red Army took the town. Stalin declared Leningrad liberated on 27 January 1943, and the next day was a celebration marked by fireworks shot from 324 Katyusha rocket launchers. By the middle of February, the Red Army had advanced another 50 to 100 miles, or 80 to 160 kilometers, to the Narva River and the old border with Estonia. The Volkhov Front also took the strategic railway hub of Staraya Russa on the south shore of Lake Ilmen on 18 February. That had been a goal for the Red Army since January 1942, so for 2 years, because it was a very important rail hub. As you can imagine, Hitler wasn't happy with the retreat at all, but he was preoccupied with the attack on Anzio, Italy. He fired Field Marshal Kukler from the command of Army Group North and replaced him with a favorite, General Model, to command the Army Group. And this was the first time that Model, who had been in charge of whole armies before, the first time he was promoted to commanding a group of armies. However, Model, on arriving, knew a problem when he saw it. And by mid-February, he convinced Hitler to authorize a retreat to the Panther line, the same strategy that Kukler had been pushing for and the reason he was fired. Even so, the Red Army kept pushing. They reached Pskov and Ostrov by the 1st of March, which is when the Rasputitsa, or in Ukrainian, Berezhina, the season of no roads began, halting progress. Retaking Zhitomyr-Berdichiv and then liberating Leningrad, those were the first 2 crushing blows of 10 against the invading Third Reich on the Eastern Front. More would come through 1944, leading to the year's other nickname, the Year of Great Victories. Anyway, I think that's enough for this episode, the Wounded Knee Special. For the next few episodes, we're going to concentrate on explaining the progress of the war on the Eastern Front chronologically. And that's going to mean a lot of zooming up and down the lines geographically, at least in our minds. The Red Army operations at different points or different areas of the Eastern Front tended to overlap for the next few months. So when you come back in 2 weeks, strap in. It's going to move fast. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Beyond Barbarossa, still the only podcast focusing on the Eastern Front of the Second World War. And as always, there will be some maps and photos on the webpage for this episode, beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. Click on the title, the text title, not the picture, unless you want to listen to the podcast episode in your web browser, which is fine. And I also want to thank all of you who are following regularly the podcast, either through a subscription or the follow button. And if you're not doing that, why don't you go and hit that follow button right now? I'd also like to make a special shout out to my Patreon supporters, Nicholas Thomas, William L. Hall, Gavin Edwards, Elliot Goldman, PFE, Craig Duncan, Tom Gaffney, Bill Hall, Ed Morley, Frog, Claude Jansen, and Kevin Milan. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Kevin. If I did, please send me the correct pronunciation by email or message. Your support means a lot, not just in terms of money, but also, well, it feels great. Any of you can support the podcast. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you're comfortable with. You can also support the podcast by leaving a rating or a review on your podcast app. That includes Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, wherever you listen. That helps let other people know that this podcast exists. I'd love to hear from you. Do you have a question, a comment, a clarification, or, I hope not, a correction? Send an email to scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca or a message through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. I'm also on Blue Sky, scottburyauthor.bsky.social. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook as well. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burr. I'm Scott Bury. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina.